George. George? What is it, George? 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 Well, yes, George. 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 All right, George.
What is it, George?
Thank you, George.
Constable George Crabtree, everyone.
Thank you, George.
George. Oh, Crabtree, grab this.
Good work, George.
George?
George. George.
George?
I'm terribly sorry, George.
And George won't die alone. George. 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 George.
George's costume.
What does it matter, George? George.
Crabtree. Crabtree, make yourself useful.
George?
George.
George Crabtree. George, Mr. Crabtree. Crabtree, what an unusual name. George?
Now, George. Oh, George, I shall.
Mr. Crabtree!
Mother.
George. George.
George.
I don't believe you.
You and Mr. Crabtree.
George. George. Yes, George, I got that part.
Thank you, George.
I'll take George. George.
Constable Crabtree!
George. George.
Constable Crabtree!
You can't do this, George. George. George.
George thought it would be a good idea. Constable Crabtree.
George Crabtree.
George.
Crabtree. 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 Good work, Crabtree.
George. I would never kill you, George.
What about Crabtree? Crabtree? No offense, Crabtree. Be careful what you say next, Crabtree. Crabtree.
George. 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 George.
Crabtree. Really, Crabtree?
Indeed, George.
Shut up, will you, Crabtree?
What have you, George?
George. George.
George.
George.
George. George. Good man, George.
George. You, me, Crabtree, and Dr. Ogden.
George. George.
George. George and I. George is planning to propose. George, what did George say?
So, George? Contemplating your final days as a bachelor, George?
Crabtree. It's all right, Crabtree.
Dearest George. George.
George.
George. I'm sorry, George.
Dear George.
George.
George. George.
George! I don't think you should, George.
George?
Ready, George? George, I swear. George, you are the star of my story, George.